All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. It's been about what has it been? A week and a half, maybe 2 weeks since I made a video. Been not so busy, just kind of a bit bored, honestly. Burnt out. Can you guys hear me okay? Is everything good? Sound good? In case anybody's watching. And so just kind of having a down day. And by the way, here's Balboa Jr. Just chilling around, chilling in the grass. Come on. And decided, what the hell, might as well make a live stream and get my mind off things with a bit of philosophy talk. So recently, about a week ago, it seems, I think it's only been about a week and a half, right, Hyperion, or actually a bit less, probably just, yeah, a week, where aloe vera for the tequila. People have what is that plant called? Uh, the one that they used to make tequila. People have them all around here. Like, I don't think they ever use them to make tequila. They look pretty cool. Nice desert plants. But anyways, as I was saying, it's been about a week since Hyperion and I ran across somebody new. A philosopher goes by the name of Jason Reza Giorgiani. Really interesting individual with really interesting ideas. I don't know if you can see him. He's just sitting on his fat butt all the way back there. One of my friends thought his name was George Johnny. Where's Josh? He was on. Tell him to come watch. Get over here. I don't know. I guess he's just pretending not to listen to me. Just sitting in the middle over there. Yeah, we found Giorgiani, and he's a really interesting guy. If you look him up on the internet, the first thing you'll find. Yes, I have pet hair all over my shirt jack slaps. I have a dog. He's a hair shedding machine. You know, you'd think that short-haired dogs aren't the ones that you should worry about for hair, but they actually are. And I'm too lazy to be changing clothes. Hey, Dan. Anyway, so we found Giorgiani, and Giorgiani's weird because, well, he's into weird shit. And Hyperion and I are into weird shit. We like the paranormal. We like the edge of science stuff. And I actually ended up watching almost all of the interviews that he's ever done. If you look him up online, the first thing you'll find is that Giorgiani is seemingly connected to the alt-right. And if you look a bit closer, you might even be horrified to find that he's lectured to people like Nazis. And so it seems pretty damning. But if you actually listen to the guy's content and what he says, the guy's not a right-winger at all. It's really bizarre. You actually look into the history of it. He attempted something that I think very few people would be brave to do. People talk about it a lot, actually, on the left. You ever heard the term détournement? Who does that come from? Does that come from, what's his name, the guy who wrote The Society of Spectacle? I'm not sure if that's where that comes from. I know Hyperion knows. Jesus Christ, he's all the way down there. It comes from Debord. And so what I think Giorgiani tried to do was sort of, not exactly détournement, it was like half of it, but to try to go in and turn the right wing from within. and he tried to use it to use this alt-right movement. And there's an interview he has with on New Thinking Aloud where Mishlove kind of grills him on this, and he gives the explanation that that's what he was set up to do. That he was never really that much into those kind of politics, and so he had like no clue who these people were. But some people that he knew hooked him up with some top brass, alt-right people, and they wanted him to basically attempt to turn them from within, and Giorgiani did. Who's the guy? Oh my God, there was a big guy that he specifically talks about that he had no clue, but everybody else knows about him. I've heard his name, but I can't remember. And he said that in private talks, he actually got this guy to admit that, and realize that a lot of his talking points were just plain bullshit. Yeah, I think it was Richard Spencer. But that Spencer actually started turning publicly, but that he ended up turning right back because he realized the money was going to dry up. And so that's sort of interesting, and that's when Giorgiani, just kind of started realizing that it wasn't going to happen. And so, yeah, you still see, you can still find all his videos and talks to right-wing audiences, but you listen to his stuff and he's not really a right-winger. Anyways, not to go too much about like his personal life. There's really not much to say about it other than he's a weird guy. He's neither, I wouldn't consider him neither right, whoa, whoa, sorry. Don't consider him neither right or left. He's kind of like this genuine attempt at going beyond that dichotomy, which is, so weird to us nowadays. We seem to think you're either on the left side or the right side. Yeah, he transcends the dichotomy for sure. He is this bizarre chimera of Heideggerianism, postmodernism, Nietzscheanism, and even Marxism. He openly, brings up Marx even when people don't ask him about it. Which is, there's one thing in which like you say, oh well, somebody brings up, like, doesn't this correspond with Marxism? And you admit, like, oh, well, yeah, it's like something I share with Marx. But no, he readily goes ahead and says, like, by the way, I took this precisely from Marx. And the big thing he takes from Marx is Marx's sort of humanist ontology, but with a Nietzschean spin on it. And he has this particular concept that he calls the spectral revolution. And it's really interesting because it's about as weird as you think it sounds. And it's even better than that. In which he says, okay, connected to the weird stuff, there is the spectral side in which, like, he believes in ESP and, perhaps life after death, reincarnations, psychic shit. And, yeah, he's also a Masochite, which, he's what is that, the religion of Ahura Mazda, Zarathustra. That's a big background for him. And it's very left-leaning stuff, except for some stuff in which, you kind of like are put on edge and you're like, that sounds a bit right-wing, but, that shouldn't be a reason to discount it, just because it sounds like something a right-winger would say. You look at the rest of the stuff and it really doesn't quite fall into that. This lazy bastard. Just laying around, chewing on grass. But anyways, the spectral revolution, he thinks that if we come to a general acceptance of weird phenomena, that's going to destroy a lot of things. And as a matter of fact, he's the first person that I've seen mention this fact. Me and Hyperion actually talked about this before, about how it's so weird that, the French radicals, and, people who are mostly postmodern and all about deconstruction and about how everything is, social construction, these people do not touch the weird shit with a 1,000-foot pole or a mile-foot pole. They stay very far away from it. They're willing to talk about schizophrenia. They're willing to talk about madness. They're not willing to talk about fucking ESP. They're not willing to talk about, the really weird shit that goes against our standard orthodox understanding of the world. And he says, whether you believe this is real or not, there is, research on this from people who are not idiots, people who aren't the fucking, people who watch Alex Jones. They work at universities, they have experiments, and they've done things, and there's interesting stuff. You could look at that and make up your mind for yourself. But if this stuff were real, he says, this destroys a lot of shit. Imagine, if the remote viewing shit is real. Just that alone, the fact that they've supposedly shown that, you can remote view the future, the past, the present, doesn't matter, and you can remote anyone, anywhere. How can you protect patents? Somebody just remote view your next patent and, patents it before you. But what if you remote view their next patent, which is going to be your future patent? Who gets what and how? It's hard to protect secrets. It's hard to protect state secrets. It's hard to protect a lot of things. So a lot of modern capitalism rests on, which is, in the intellectual property capitalism, is out the window. It's destroyed and it's gone. Remote view, remote view the past all the time. I bet you do, Jack Slaps. How was that donkey show you went to yesterday, by the way? Degenerate Floridians. Oh god, I have to check my Steam messages actually. I haven't logged into that in like about half a year. And a friend of mine told me he was going to message me something to go do. So there's that aspect, that kind of weird shit destroys the modern way of doing things, both politically and economically. And so, that's revolutionary. You'd think like, well, if the shit is real, if you're a leftist and you find out it's real, you want to push it. You want to push it really hard. But you notice that actually not even the right wing touches this with the left foot, with a mile foot pole. It's the really fringe right wing that does that. It just so happens that, if you move around the weird communities, most of them are right wing, which is weird. It's at the same time not weird, obviously, because, right wing people tend to be sort of, more conservative, traditionalist, religious, and therefore they're more likely to buy into bullshit. Like this kind. And I don't doubt that most people who are into this stuff really are into it for really dumb reasons. They're not very critical about it. But if you're critical about it, you realize, it's, some of this stuff seems to point towards the reality of something more. Perhaps pushing that is a way to break through the current paradigms of capital. And then there's another second aspect to the spectral revolution, which is spectrum. He's against the whole dichotomy of it's either this or that. He's right there. He's against the dichotomies that it's either this or that. And so what do you get? You get this spectrum. Everything's on a spectrum. And, and this is actually pretty big in the postmodernist community. That, things are not exactly this or that. They can be, in between or both. And, that's because the categories don't really exist. And, everything is just fucking fudge in reality. And that's fine. And, I agree with that to a certain extent. Reality is a mess. It's slippery. It's fuzzy. Some people have a certain word. They say it's gooey. This is actually particularly from I think it's Ian Grant Hamilton, a Schellingian, and he calls it gooey. I don't know these people, man. They come up with some really weird ass terms, and I'm like, couldn't you come up with something better? Goo. Sure, man, sure. I don't think that's going to catch on. There's also the sense of the spectral in which, it's like, it literally comes from, a Marxist thing of, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And what does that mean? There's this beyond looming which is coming, and it's threatening to destroy the status quo as we know it. So there's that side of the spectral revolution. And so he thinks that if we had, or, we're always, assuming that it's true, technically then we would always be in the middle of a spectral revolution, really. And he kind of admits to that. Where the spectral side of things is the side which keeps moving. I mean, literally, this is analogous to a dialectic. There's always a beyond, and there's something always threatening to break through the boxes that we put the world into. And, that's pretty neat. So, I got his book called Prometheus and Atlas. I read the introduction, which was 50 pages. Like typical philosopher, Typical philosopher, an introduction of 50 pages. But it was a good introduction. I read it in a couple of hours. But I'm really a slow reader. I take forever to read things. I highlight things which to you may seem inane, but to me it's just kind of like keeping things in track. And I like to make comments and underlines, and do a point by point stuff. And even in the introduction, I took time to do that, which is maybe a waste of time because he goes into depth of everything else in the remaining essays. But it was really interesting. He has this thing about thinking that Kantian aesthetic ideas, which are he takes from the Critique of Pure Judgment, or the Critique of Judgment, and he thinks that Kant's insight there, is what points Schelling towards the idea that that aesthetics is more fundamental than philosophy. Ultimately, it tells us more about the world than philosophy can, and that these ideas, transcend reason and transcend nature as well, or rather, they are the true nature of things, which transcends reason. And Kant seems to have this kind of view as well, in which he says, there's these aesthetic ideas which we can experience. And even though they're beyond our concepts, we can't grasp them completely in concepts. Nonetheless, we get determinate content and concepts, by encountering them, and we know exactly what we're talking about once we start, working with them. But once you try to get to the universal level, you can't do it. And so Schelling apparently takes this point on later, and Giorgiani takes Schelling's point, which Schelling makes is magical. Schelling says the transcendental aesthetic ideas, it's not just, you have a deeper connection to nature because, you've had the revelation of nature to you, in putting yourself in a mystical state, an aesthetic, artistic state. Apparently Schelling says this shit is literally magical, and he says that, the ideal of society is to recover this capacity, which apparently, he believes we had in the long past. And if you know anything about Atlantis and the whole story of Atlantis, you would know a little bit about this. But Schelling says, by the way, this is not just about aesthetic ideas and accessing that higher reality of, knowledge. No, it's also that, the aesthetic ideas affect us, but we affect them, and therefore we have a reciprocal, spooky spiritual relation to the world itself, in which, if we could figure out how to, master this power in general, we basically become magicians, sorcerers in a way. Look at him, he's just laying down. And so, that's where, I think Giorgiani probably will lose most people, because they'll be like, oh God, this is bullshit. But it's interesting, it's interesting nonetheless. The book is 500 pages. I'll endeavor to try to read it, but, I'm a really slow reader, and I have these like phases in which I just get bored of something, and I leave it for a while and just sit on it and come back. But anyways, that's enough on Giorgiani. There's not really much to say. I've only read the introduction. All I gotta say is, if you're interested in weird stuff, Giorgiani's definitely somebody who I think is worth looking at. I think he's the only competent philosopher that I've known of yet who really has something interesting to say. There are plenty of other philosophers that talk about weird shit. I watch the channel New Thinking Aloud, and Mishlev has interviewed quite a few philosophers. None of them interest me whatsoever, because to me they all are pre-Kantians. It's the same shit of, well, things seem to be this way, and let's posit these categories and let's see how they work out. It's just kind of this dogmatic idealism and back and forth, and there's some kind of versions of dogmatic naturalism as well. But Giorgiani is well aware of the Kantian turn, and he works within that Kantian turn in the post-Heideggerian response to that. And so that's interesting, and it's unique, and I haven't seen anybody else who's done that. Not only that, the whole idea of the spectral revolution, if you buy into the weird shit. Running on empty food reviews. Yeah, he's emotionless. Is that the channel of that weird guy who just like goes and sits in restaurants? He has a suit on, and like eats food quietly. Doesn't show any expressions, gives a review. Yeah, I think that's the guy. Like Giorgiani's weird. Like he doesn't show expression for shit. Just kind of like a inanimate. Yeah, you think people would be excited, but anyways, he's interesting. So enough about that. Something else on philosophy. I was arguing with somebody on Facebook today. I think they're Indian American here. They're obviously a philosophy grad, or at least they're studying philosophy, close to being grads. Oh yeah, before I change topics, if you buy into the weird stuff and you're not too scared about that, or you're not too put off about that, honestly, you know, have you ever heard the phrase capitalist realism? Who is it that wrote that? Hyperion? Who came up with that idea? You know, which is just the conceptual description of the fact that, you know, we've come to a point in which, yeah, Mark Fisher, we've come to a point where almost nobody has a vision of a future that isn't just a repetition of capitalist logic. You know, even if you look at leftists, communists, and the way they deal with the issue, the way they see it, it's just an extension of capitalist logic for the most part. You know, it's still just this mechanistic productive view, you know, and they don't have a very nuanced view of the future. And the ones who do have some kind of nuance to a humanistic view of a human world have a rather limited view, you know, and it's very abstract. You know, it's based on, you know, these mostly platitudes of, you know, the ideality of, oh, well, you know, labor will be free, and, you know, we'll all just be kind of like, you know, philosopher, artist, or whatever, you know, work will be over, and, you know, you'll work whenever you want, and you'll work at whatever you want. You know, that's kind of idealism is worthless to me, and it doesn't really look like a world you want to live in. I mean, the way they describe it, it's kind of the Christian, you know, heavenly utopia. You know, when you hear it described, you're like, do I really want to live in that? God, that sounds boring. And Giorgiani, honestly, you know, his vision of the future is, yes, it's a Heideggerian, you know, but his Heidegger is so weird. His Heidegger, he has a Heidegger lecture, and you listen to it, and you're like, am I listening to Heidegger, or, you know, is it that, you know, because this sounds like Hegel, you know, like Heidegger's theory of history, like sounds very close to Hegel, not in the grand scale, but, you know, on the just the specific details of, you know, the historicity of things. No problem, Dan. The historicity of things. And there's also the Nietzschean positivity, and, you know, it's a very positive Nietzschean view, you know. You know, it's not the whole, like, well, let's stomp on everybody who's an inferior or whatnot, even though it is about the point about, you know, if we're going to be supermen, let's be supermen. You know, no point in beating around the bush. You know, let's push everybody to be the greatest they can be. You know, a true aristocracy, and all that jazz. And his vision is also utopian idealistic. He has no conception of how this could really happen. You know, he has no determination of a state in which this is possible. You know, he has certain things he can say about how he thinks it's not going to be democratic, that democracy just really won't work in a world like that, and all these other things. And if you fetishize democracy, I don't know, you'll probably not like that, but I'm not too much of a fan of democracy either. You know, I think it's it's something that if we could do without, God, it would be so much better. Most of the time, it's not the best. Let's just say that. I think a lot of problems arise with a society that is not ready for democracy. I think that's part of the problem, that you need to develop a society which is ready for that, as opposed to just let everybody just go with it. But then again, you know, that whole determination comes out of the bottom. You know, it's not that, oh, the aristocrats one day realized and became enlightened and, you know, decided to elevate society to that standpoint. Of course that's never gonna fucking happen. It hasn't happened ever before. Normies ruin everything, Dan. So anyways, as I was saying, I think Giorgiani offers something of a real alternative to capitalist realism. You know, it seems to give a genuine possible vision of something really radically new, that isn't just more of the fucking same. You know, you listen to Giorgiani, and We need a Stalin who rules with an iron fist to create a society ready for democracy. I don't know. It depends what you mean by iron fist. I think we've talked about this where the reality of things is, to build Oscar Wilde said democracy means simply the bludgeoning of the people by the people for the people. I think full democracy would be ideal once everyone could be full educated. Yeah, that's the idea. And it's not really just full education. There's something about that that's not enough. It's not just to have an intellectual grasp. We have to find out, really. We have to find out some way in which we can go beyond the intellectual grasp, because you can teach people the concepts. You can make people, become indoctrinated in a world, in which like all that exists is Kantian morality. They won't act on it. The intellectual grasp is not enough. You really have to know it at a very basic, fundamental, visceral level. Like morality really cannot just remain in your head. Ultimately, there has to be this elevation of the biological, of the irrational, in harmony with the rational. Because if you have people with, just the urges of the irrational, just because you present it with the rational doesn't mean they'll choose it. You have to actually inculcate the love of reason, the love of wisdom. And that's a very different affair from just, oh, we'll send kids to school. That's a much bigger program than people are willing to admit. It reaches a point of, you wonder, is this indoctrination or is this really education? And that's one of the things I actually agree with Giorgiani, by the way. Giorgiani is one of the few people who comes to admittance. And I know at least a good friend of mine, Tree, I call him Tree, I'll not mention his name, he knows. Even he, he's a Stoic, but he's come to, he says he likes the Stoics. He's also a Hegelian Marxist, very, very much into Lukács. And he himself says, I've come to the realization that it seems to me like we cannot have a genuine philosophy and a genuine politics and a genuine society which does not include in itself the religious standpoint. That we somehow have to have a religion that is rational, but not rational in that like it's just in your head. It has to, deify reason, yes, but it has to be something that people really, really can connect to. You can't have the whole what is it? What was it that French revolutionary? What's his name? Oh my God, Robespierre. You can't have what Robespierre tried to do, which is, to just make a fucking religion from nowhere, make it autistic, and then expect people are gonna buy into it. Yeah, that's not how religion works. That's not how any of that works. So you've got to develop things in an organic manner, which nonetheless has a rational structure and is for a rational purpose. And that's not easily said or done. It seems that everybody who's ever tried just fucking fails. Except for the Stoics, at least the original Stoics. Tree doesn't like the Roman Stoics. He thinks they were garbage. But he says that the Greek Stoics, as well as the Greek skeptics, who had very similar things, they had a view towards, this religion of reason. Bloch kind of said that in relation to the rationalism of music. I think music is, back before I read Hegel, back when I was still a pre-Hegelian, I was kind of like a Kantian, but at the same time I was more of a mystic. I thought that the highest aesthetic was music. And the reason why is because music is the one thing which touches you in the most visceral way, which no other art can immediately do. Every other art is capable of doing this, but not immediately. Music can do it immediately, and it's, Robespierre's problem was adopting a bourgeois Greek aesthetic and proclaiming himself a god. I didn't know he proclaimed himself a god. I just knew he had, what was it, the cult of the supreme being? What was it called? But yeah, in a society that's fully integrated, fully aware of itself as a society, and producing itself as a society, you would have a pretty strong, set of controls for what enters your culture. The things that we have right now, in which like it's like anything goes. Um, that's dangerous on very, very many levels, because you allow the influence of things at certain ranges of education, uh, which are just problematic, to use a word there. Because we can all agree, you know, part of the problem nowadays is that media is uncontrolled. The fact that your kid can just go online and people leave their kids to fucking watch YouTube all day. It used to be TV. Shit. Even educational TV. That stuff is not good in my opinion. That does not replace a real human interaction for children. That I've seen people grow up with that. Um, something seems off about it to me. Very off. I think people need a real sociality. Even shows which are supposed to teach you morality, all these other things, there are failures. There are failures very immediately. So there's crazy rationalism in kids media. Do I work out? No, I do not even lift. But yeah, the media. Well, we know media is irrationalistic, right? Well, we know almost all of it, like overwhelmingly, is just marketing. It's just trying to sell you shit. It's trying to sell you ideas. It's trying to sell you products, to buy. And everybody knows this. It's not just some kind of mystery of, oh well, it's just philosophers philosophizing. They don't really know anything. Well, we know that they've done the studies. They know that this really affects children deeply. That marketing to kids is really, really dangerous. Do you ever listen to free jazz, Daniel? I didn't know about what the hell free jazz was. Until I appeared on one day. What was it, like about a month ago? Him and Josh were talking, and they Josh linked a meme, I think, from the SpongeBob episode where like they're pretending to be Squidward, uh, and like Hyperion's like, by the way, and like somebody played actual jazz music over the clip, and Hyperion's like, the original like clip of that is actually far closer to real free jazz, which sounds like fucking noise to me, but they swear to me that there is some beautiful structure there, which I don't understand. I'm gonna get up and walk. Because Balboa Jr. is just laying around being sad and bored. Go walk, come on. I don't get free jazz. Anyways, since Hyperion mentioned it, just might be a whole stream about Giorgiani, I suppose. Giorgiani has this concept of Prometheus and Atlas, and he calls these transcend, the Kantian aesthetic ideas in the Schellingian sense, in which, if you know Max Stirner, they're basically spooks, except unlike Max Stirner, who thought that spooks had to do with what we, actively believed. At least that's what I think. I'm not claiming to know because I haven't read Max Stirner. So if you've read Max Stirner, tell me that I'm wrong. Go ahead. And Prometheus and Atlas are basically two fundamental, in the Hegelian sense, spirits. They're the fundamental Western duality of technology and science, theoretical science, where Prometheus is the technological drive for utilitarian mastery, and Atlas is the scientific modeling drive to put the world inside a box, a conceptual box. Giordani takes Heidegger and root is saying this has been a boon, it has been a blessing, but it's also currently our damnation because uh, we are basically controlled by these spooks, these spirits, these aesthetic ideas, and we don't realize it because we don't understand what technology and what science really is. We don't understand that these things are fundamentally tools, that they're not reality, that they're just ways we mediate our relationship and understanding of reality. And so his general thesis on those is that in a spectral revolution, the realization comes about that science itself is spectral, that it's just a spook, that that it's not real, and that we don't have to die upon that hill. So once we understand Prometheus and Atlas as the core principles driving our Western lineage, and he says it's specifically Western. He says he puts it against the Indian and the Chinese, and says those are very different. There's a reason those didn't make it to where we are, on their own. But I'm not going to argue about that. That has to do with understandings of history and philosophical thought lineages and all that stuff. But he says, once we understand what these are, we'll be all the much better for it. And he brings in people like Paul Feyerabend, who argue for an epistemological anarchism, in which we don't have a scientific worldview of one theory. We don't have one theory for everything. I know that's a drive for everybody. That's a drive even for me. We want one single picture. There is an intuition, and I think it is a properly true intuition, that the world must be one, that everything has to become under the comprehension of one real set of principles. But we're at such an early beginning that we don't really have a reason to believe that we have anything close to that single principle. The unification of the sciences, even within themselves, is not complete, let alone amongst them. And so I'm all for this idea of epistemological anarchism, which we have various theories. You can have your relativity, you can have these people who are anti-relativistics, you can have neo-Newtonians in physics, you can have a lot of things. And, if you actually look into the fringe, yes, are they as developed as relativity is? Well, if you've had God knows how many thousands of people working on the theory for 100 years, of course nobody's going to come right out of the gate and have anything close to it. But if you look at what these people try to fix, what they try to point out in their theories, it's interesting stuff, it's real problems, and the standard orthodox theories don't answer them. And so, do we have to do all or nothing thinking like we have today? And I think the obvious answer is obviously no. We don't. We can have multiple models. We can accept that they're all models. And if we accept that they're all models, we're open. We're open as science should be. If your first reaction to hearing about spooky, weird things is to immediately go, well, that's not possible based on what I know. Well, you're not God. You don't know what's actually really possible in the world. So you have no ground to say that other than, assumptions about the world. And another thing, if your second reaction is, well, to go find something to debunk things that you haven't even looked into, that's just based on assumptions that things can be explained from one perspective, because what is debunked in one perspective is not debunked in another. And so, if you're a materialist and you want to debunk something about, idealism, well, you're playing a one-sided game. You're not really being objective about that. I'm totally on board with Hegel, who says the only worthy refutation of anything is an immanent refutation. Either the thing stands on its own or it falls on its own. You can't pretend to use an external principle and come knock something down. And here people are talking in the comments about Max Stirner. We know a Stirnerite, by the way, and I don't think he's much of a Stirnerite. It's an acquaintance of mine named Laz. He likes Max Stirner because the ego in its own. I'm not sure he really understands Max Stirner, but I don't think he quite cares. He says Max Stirner is superior to Nietzsche. I highly doubt it. Actually, I highly doubt that. Because it's not just because Stirner is a meme, but I don't think that just the idea of spooks and the supremacy of the ego or the unique one, really, really is analogous to the idea of the Superman, the Übermensch rather, or Nietzsche's critiques of rationalism and presuppositions. It seems to me I've never encountered anybody who can really analogize those. I don't doubt that there's probably some similarity there, but I doubt that it's as deep. Who said that? Who are you asking, Hyperion? What are you doing? Oh yeah, there is a new translation that came out a couple of years ago, right? Of the unique one and its property. So if you're going to read Max Stirner, you can find it free on LibGen. I mean, the author put it there for free. The translator, I mean. Anyways, to shift away from the weird stuff. I was having an argument on Facebook today, crossing over from yesterday, with somebody who is an Indian American. I assume they're probably a grad student. I mean, they definitely talk with the technical sophistication that you would expect of somebody who's at least nearing their graduation in philosophy. I don't like much of the continental jargon. I think it's rather fruitless. I think it's a rather sad state of affairs in which it keeps philosophy from being communicable to lay people. It makes it way too difficult. You take regular words and you twist them in ways that are so different from what they regularly mean by ontologizing them and by playing etymological and semantic word games. But anyways, this person was talking about communism and how they thought, that communism was the realization of the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, and he says the relation of class, is a dissolution of the, of an emptiness and all these other things. My response to that was, well, if you're talking about communism, no, it's not Danput. It's Kazi something. But my response to that was, well, if you're talking about communism in the standard sense that people talk about communism, which, it's almost always Marxist nowadays, it's very rare, what you're talking about is nonsense, because, it's like taking the Nagarjunian Madhya Mika, I think that's what the philosophy is called, a dialectical style, to that. It's just an external thing. It doesn't really tell you very much. It's a rather, you can tell when things are very superficial, honestly. They seem deep only because you don't understand them, but once you actually grasp what they are, you're like, what good is that? It's like people talking about Hegel and negation of negation of negation, and they think they're telling you something very meaningful. Well, oh, you're talking about Dan's wife. But anyway, so there's, God, great job. You broke my stream of consciousness there. I forget what I was saying. Oh yeah, people who try to talk about negation and negation about things. I'm interested in the motivation of this channel. Is it just for fun, or is it for some moral reason, or spreading knowledge or something? I do find the videos fun. Both. I do this because I get ideas in my head, and I've decided, one way to work them out is by, just talking to myself on video or writing, because I usually just write things on blogs, which I then never publish. It's just private ruminations. And I thought, well, why just keep them private? People might find my weird sayings and insights interesting, or might be even useful, to ruminate and philosophize publicly. I think Hegel said something very interesting about that, about how, many philosophers, pretty much almost all of them, you find in the works only the appearance of finished products, but you don't see the actual thinking process that leads to that product. And if you actually saw the thinking process, you would realize that the process of philosophizing and reasoning is very, very different to the appearance of a systematic, coherent system at the end. You take Spinoza's philosophy, for example, which was his prime example there, and he says, the geometric style of Spinoza is not really how Spinoza philosophized. It's not how he really came up with his theorems. It's not how he really came up with his conclusions. And I think there's a value in seeing actual philosophizing happen. I think there's just so much crap out there in which people are shown finished products of philosophy, and they don't understand what philosophy really is because they don't see how it's really done, and therefore they think that philosophy is just taking something about somebody that and then just slapping it on and say, oh, well, this reminds me of Plato's cave. Well, what good does that do? And and all that jazz. So that's part of why I do the channel. Yes, it's amusing to me. I like getting comments. It's very rare. Comments help me. If people ask questions, it forces me to articulate things and think. So anyways, well, what was I going on about? Back to the whole thing about negation. Negation and jargon, empty jargon. So this person was talking about communism and how, they saw in it, the Buddhist logic of Nagarjuna's logic, which is a dialectical logic, but it's a formal dialectical logic. And my response to that was like, well, no, if you're talking about Marxist communism, that doesn't really work. You have to talk about how it's a contentful nothingness. It's contentful nothingness, and if you know how the Hegelian dialectic really works, come on, hey, come on. If you know how the dialectical philosophy of Hegel really works, you know that you don't get to communism, even with Marx, by just going, oh, well, we're going to realize the emptiness of class, and that's why we have communism. We're going to realize the emptiness of work, and that's how we're going to have a free artistic society. That's not how it works at all. That doesn't tell you anything. And it's the same thing with people who talk about negation, and they think they're talking about something deep. Mauhaus is stupid. I'm sorry, but Mao's. If you ever read Mao's thing on contradiction, it's stupid. It really is. I don't know who thinks that is some grand insight, but if you really think about what he says, it's so banal, it's so basic, that it's not really an insight at all. It has nothing it's not a grand philosophical realization of anything. And so, people who keep talking about negation, well, who cares? They give the example, well, Hegel says, the blood, sorry, the bud negates, the flower, or, the flower negates the bud, and, the fruit negates the flower. Well, why the fuck would you want to talk about that? That's stupid. Why would you want to talk it in terms of negation? Who cares? That doesn't fucking tell you anything. When you want to talk about the real negation, you talk about the process that's actually going on. You talk about how the things really are negated. You talk about, there's a whole growth process going on. There's photosynthesizing. There's a teleological process of, self-production in the organism and all these other things. And let me know if the wind gets into the microphone, people. I'm noticing a bit of wind. And and if you talk about that, you're not talking about this weird abstract shit of negation. You're not talking about being and nothing. You're talking about real concrete things on the concrete level, and that's how you should always be talking about things, honestly. The stuff about, oh well, it's a negation. That's interesting simply because you notice how things build up. That's about it. It's not really helpful for any other thing. You talk about exchange and how it negates, the use value of commodity. Well, who the fuck cares? That's stupid. And anyways, and my point about that was, I was arguing with this person. And they come in and they said, well, you're not the one who owns the concept of communism. It's not more, we don't have to just use Hegelian logic or these things. I'm like, well, but you're talking about a concept from somebody else. And you're clearly referencing their concept. And you're pretending that, this other abstraction that you're trying to apply to it, is somehow deep, and it's not. And then we get into an argument about, reason and the validity of reason and the universality of reason. And this person is a postmodernist. They don't believe in objective truth, and they don't believe in universality. And that kind of, got me off on a train about, well, what are you doing then? Are you making claims that to not be universal and to have, no rational force whatsoever? Well, apparently you're not, because, in one breath, one sentence, they make positive assertions that they think are true about, the world as such. And then in the next one, somebody brings in, well, how do you know? And they're like, well, reason and logic are all provisional and conventional. And they're like, you've undermined your own claims. How can you be making any claims when you don't believe that claims really have any validity whatsoever? If you don't believe that there is an objective logic to things, how can you even be communicating with me? How do we know that we're not talking past each other? Yeah, I know that ego doesn't come from Stirner. That's a translation error. That he talks about the unique one. When Fichte says, quote, the I is all, this seems to harmonize perfectly with my statements, but it's not the I is all, but the I destroys all, and I, only the self-dissolving I, the never-being I, the finite I, is actually I. Fichte speaks of the absolute I, but I speak of me, the transient I. I think there's a bit of semantic there in which that's also... that's just reordering things and putting focus in a different way. As I comprehend it, that is ego. Ego is indeed this finite I. There's the absolute ego. But there's differences between the ontological levels, and there's also mergings. And that's what makes all this German idealist stuff so difficult. You have to notice at what level you're talking about and what your interests really are. I've read a bit of Fichte, and I mean very little bit. And I have this book on Fichte and Marx, and it's really good because it goes a bit over the Aristotelian and Fichtean heritage of Marx, and how Marx is actually closer to Fichte than he is to Hegel for the most part. And it's very interesting. And it shows you that Fichte himself was ambivalent as to who the real I is. He talks about how the absolute I, the absolute ego, is just kind of this theoretical positing that's necessary. There's a backwards deduction, there's a forward deduction, and depending on where you are, the only one that really matters to Fichte ends up being indeed the finite, the practical I, which is why Fichte's philosophy ends up being one of the infinite striving. You can never achieve everything that you want. You can never achieve full goodness. You can never achieve the truly rational state. You can never, really live up to ethics. But nonetheless, it's this process of striving that is determinative. And this gets transformed with with Hegel into other things, into the fact that the striving is indeed the absolute I. It's not a failure, but it's rather the consummation, the realization of it. But anyways, going back to that whole thing about the Facebook stuff, it just kind of pisses me off when people are not aware of that. Like how are you not aware that you're a skeptic, but you're a pseudo skeptic? It bothers me. It bothers me when people play this game in which, oh well, I really don't believe in reason. I don't believe the universality stuff. I just believe in finitude, and everybody has just different perspectives. Well, then what are you trying to do? Convince us? You don't believe in it, so why are you trying? And then they try to justify themselves with reason. They don't go ahead and say, well, I can respect people like Nietzsche, for example, or, the Buddha himself, who finally said, like, look, yeah, reason doesn't do anything. Reason is, just an illusion. You can't know anything by reason. Fine. If you can be open about that, I can respect that. I can respect that Nietzsche thought that a good argument was a punch to your fucking face. Stepping all over you and walking past you and getting shit done. Sure, okay. But, Nietzsche wasn't pretending to be making any rational argument to convince you. Even though, nonetheless, he was making a rational argument to convince you. But, he was well aware of the contradiction. And so this person just kind of annoys me in that they walk back and forth between, I want to rationally convince you, but I don't believe in reason. And so, the whole thing doesn't work. It just undermines itself. And I'm just like, what's with you? Rush McGee, I feel like there's an element of faith in following reason that we have to act through it or starve. Depends on what you mean by faith. I think that once once you start looking at metacognition, which is what Hegel really does in the science of logic, there's no need for faith. You observe what reason really does, and then you can see how absolute circuits of reason form. And then there's no question of, well, why is this the case? How is this possible? How is this working? You know exactly how it's working. You know exactly the entire determination. And so you don't have to worry about, maybe I'm misunderstanding things. Maybe I'm looking at through the wrong categories. You're not using other categories. You're just doing pure thought movements, with basic structures of determination, including the absence of any given determination. And so that stuff gets you out of faith because it's no longer a matter of faith. It just is. But it is an immediate way. It's a way that you can now explain. You can have contradictions in the classical skepticism, in which you can argue for completely contradictory things and not know which one is true. They're both equally true and they're both equally false. The same thing Nagarjuna does. He says, well, if this can be true here, it's also false here, and it could be true and false here. It could be neither true nor false. And he just kind of goes through the I forget what the methodology is called, but it has 4 possible truth values. True, not true, both true and not true, or neither true nor not true. It doesn't use the law of the excluded middle. But Nagarjuna can't explain why we should think that's reasonable. He can't explain that that's actually rational to do. He just assumes it, just how Aristotle assumes, the law of identity and the law of the excluded middle and all these other things. But, I just think it's superior. Hegel's method is just superior, simply because you don't have to do that. You don't have to assume anything. You just deal with content and you work with it. And you're implicitly working with the real cognition of things. You don't have to go and appeal to any law of identity or go and say, well, this isn't possible because of the law of the excluded middle. If it happens, it happens. If it is, it is. Reason is reason, according to its own dynamics. So in that capacity, I don't think there is the problem of faith. But, people still make that argument, and I can't convince you about that unless you enter the circuit, to see it for yourself. Beaslin says, I'm contesting the error that Stirner believed in an ego, not that Stirner claimed to be an egoist, which he admits is a phantom. Okay, I can accept that. You know, that it's one thing to talk about like what people are doing as opposed to what they are explicitly stating. Because I think those are two different things. That you can state something and believe that you're actually, you know, believe whatever it is you claim to believe. But what you're actually doing is completely contradictory. Piran says, is it a conceptual semantic disagreement? What is meant by der Einzig for him that determines it to be conceptually different from ego? And yeah, that's how I see it. From the Hegelian point of view, you're playing semantics here of you want the content of the ego, but you don't want the form, and therefore you reject the form and you say, oh no, I don't have that, but you're still doing it. You're still doing it. You're still acting in the capacity of the ego. You know, if you say, well, the ego is just this non-I, this constant erosion of everything, but that's exactly what the ego is for Hegel. You know, that's exactly what the ego is. You know, for quite a few people, it's precisely this movement, the shift. It's the action of undoing. And what is undoing? You know, it's the thing itself is undoing itself. You know, maybe you can go and say, oh, well, I just don't believe in the soul. I don't believe in the permanent individual ego. Well, that's a whole different thing. And even then, there's some conceptual confusions that may be cleared up for various reasons as to who means what and why. And whether these really are ultimate distinctions or whether they are just illusions we're partaking by not realizing how we are actually thinking. I mean, it's kind of like a whole thing. What is it? I've been slowly, I mean, I'm really slowly reading Thus Spake Zarathustra from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says a lot of things which, you know, just kind of catch me off guard because I had assumptions about Nietzsche. But, you know, I try to read without assumptions. And he says a lot of things about how, you know, he doesn't believe in the ego either. You know, he thinks that, you know, the ego is, you know, doesn't really exist and it's just this raw process of, you know, of activity, of power, and all these other things. But nonetheless, you know, is that really a denial of the ego? Just like how the Buddhists say, oh, there's no self. But then you grill them on that and it's like, well, what do you really mean by that? And they'll give a verbal distinction. But when you see the operation of it, it's not really a distinction at all. You know, the people who claim that there is no self, nonetheless, do believe in a self. And they will admit to it too. And they will admit to you, well, it's a contradiction, you know, it's just that we don't agree with one version of the self, but we think the self is this other thing. And that ends up being it. And when you actually look more into it, you realize that there's not much of a difference. You look at Buddhism, and then you look at, say, Advaita Vedaita. Yeah, I think Advaita Vedaita, non-dualism. And you look at their concept of the self, and it's just the positive spin of the Buddhist concept of the self. They think it's just as empty. They think it's just as indeterminate. They think it's just a pure process. The only thing is, they take the positive spin. They say it is, and the Buddhists say, well, it isn't. You know, it's via negativa and via positiva. And they're talking about the same exact thing. And no matter what they tell you, and all of them will say, no, we're not talking about the same exact thing. But look at what they're doing. They're talking about the same exact thing. And, you know, that's kind of funny. What are my thoughts on Schelling? Begrudging respect is pretty much how I put it. I don't like Schelling's style, but I can respect him as a philosopher. And I think he was right on more things than I'm probably aware, and for which I would want to give him credit for. But I'm willing to give him credit. You know, I think he's an interesting philosopher. I think he's worth reading. I want to read more of him. It's just a chore. It's a chore to work through deciphering how thought is moving in his works. You know, especially it's a chore when you're doing it alone. I mean, I have such trouble reading alone. It bores me. even though I can do it, if I just like sit myself down and start working through a text. But I'm willing to admit that there's insights Schelling has which Hegel does not focus on. The same thing with Heidegger. I'm not a fan of Heidegger. I have a friend of mine, Tree. Well, I'll call him Tree, and he was into Heidegger when we first met him, and what he originally told us just seemed to me to be like a waste of time. But then I kind of warmed up to Heidegger as well when I hear certain things about him, because I'm like, wait a minute, yeah, that's true. But even though the people who are saying those things, go and Heidegger himself was like, Hegel could never conceive of this. To me, it's like, no, it goes right into the system, and I can already start seeing where it goes into the system, in various places. And so, for example, a lot of what Heidegger speaks, what all the existentialists speak about, would go straight into the philosophy of subjective spirit, straight up there, at the point between subjective and objective spirit, you start getting the Heideggerian view of things, perfectly there. Not exactly as Heidegger wants it. Heidegger's focus is different, but just because Heidegger has a certain focus doesn't mean that much of what he says, doesn't really fall into the Hegelian system as a whole. And obviously that's why people kind of hate Hegel, because you can't get away from him no matter what you try. It's kind of, it feels like a cheat philosophy, because you can always go, well, no, this actually goes right back into the system. And they're like, well, how? And to them it seems like trickery. It seems like, you're just trying to save face, just trying to incorporate everything else. But that's how Hegelianism has always been. It always incorporates everything else. There's, just because Hegel, couldn't see a certain, is philosophy the love of knowledge or the study of opinion? I kind of sided with Hegel in that philosophy is not the love of wisdom, it's the realization of wisdom. Philosophy is, that's why Hegel in the phenomenology says, we should move from philosophy to science with a capital S, because that was its destiny in the first place. It's the Platonic to Aristotle move, which Aristotle also says, we ought to start doing science, not just this philosophizing. And Aristotle actually makes dialectic a lesser form of knowing. He thinks it's about dissolving opinions. Whereas, of course, Hegel, takes it back up and says, no, it's about how we find the truth, really. But in the ultimate sense, I think philosophy really ends up being everything. It's not a specific thing, and therefore everything that people do that has been called philosophy may not be strictly philosophy as philosophy, which Hegel considers only to be meta-philosophy. Adam Tidor says, there's a quote by Heidegger that says that thinking begins only when we have come to know that reason, glorified for centuries, is a stiff-necked adversary of thought. You can't really understand Hegel through Hegel. You understand something always through something else. For me, Heidegger's ontology, or his attempt to take away the fixation of the Western thought on entities, really builds up my understanding of the dialectic and the reason. But then there just appears to be a distinction between thinking and reason. Now, I think you can understand Hegel through Hegel quite well. It's the same way that you can understand reason through reason. Being is nothing. That's really all that can be said about that. Being is nothing, and the fact that we can understand that, the fact that we can really comprehend that, the fact that we can comprehend that this is really a cognition of cognition, is all the proof you need that reason is the one thing in this world that really is not thought through anything else. You can talk about language and say, well, what about language and cultural considerations and whatnot. And Hegel himself says, yeah, of course, you'll use those things, but those things aren't determinative of what reason actually is. None of those things has anything to do, has no impact whatsoever on the fact that immediacy of thought is immediacy of thinking. None of that has anything to do with the fact that the faculty of judgment really does work a certain way with certain content. And so this idea that, reason or thought are opposed here is, to me, ludicrous. It depends on what you mean by reason or thought, really. If you're talking about reason as in, these standard notions of logic, well, of course, yes. Those are definitely the enemies of thought. Formal standard reason is a fraud. It's not real logic. It's not real reasoning. And so, because let me tell you, let me put it this way. Hegel is an empirical rationalist. The science of logic is based on the experience of reason in an abstracted form. There are other forms of reason in history, which you can look at in various philosophies, which will base themselves on one mode of reason as the privileged mode of reason. Hegel doesn't have this privileging of any single mode. Hegel's final privileged mode is the idea. The absolute idea is just literally the self-reflexive capacity of cognition itself. It itself is just the generative process for the entire determinations of any possible thought you could ever have, Heideggerian or otherwise. If you have this experience of the... if you have this experience of the revelation of Dasein, and you come back and you think about that, you're engaging in logic. Yeah, you're always engaging in logic, no matter what you tell yourself. These experiences are always recollected in a certain way. You think about them in a certain way. And if new experiences, you will have new logics. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. You will always have new logics. The question is, has anybody asked them up with a really new logical concept, as opposed to a new instantiation of the same? Because even nowadays, post-logic, you find out in the rest of the philosophies of nature and subjective and objective and absolute spirit, that it's all just a reinstantiation of the modes of relation which appear in the science of logic, because those are the pure modes of relation. Everything else is just a determinate instantiation of it. You can always pinpoint to space, even if you think about it as space. If you realize that it's self-externality, nonetheless you have to realize that you're thinking about this in a logical quantity, and that's the ultimate logical essentiality of space. Can you reduce space to just pure abstract quantity? No, you cannot. There's a difference there. It's why the difference is between the ideas and concepts. And so, when I hear people say this, Giorgiani is somebody who talks about the Kantian aesthetic ideas, which are beyond reason. My response to that is, well, how are you making this determination? How can you know that these things are really beyond reason if you can talk about them? If you yourself can reflect on them and know something about them, the immediate knowledge of whatever it is that you experience is not necessary for the capacity of you to be able to eventually cognize what these really are. I think that a lot of the weird shit that people say is completely beyond reason, unexplainable, is in fact not beyond reason, unexplainable. It's beyond our reason because we don't have all the facts. But this reason, this absolute cognition that we have, if there are higher entities, if you can think about aliens that have, some capacities other than us, the capacity is not that they can think in some different way. The capacity is simply they can experience things differently. And therefore, they would have indeed different logics because they can experience relations which we cannot. So if you ask me, do I think that we are capable of absolute knowledge? And my answer is probably not right now. We are not even close. though I do believe entirely that we are capable of absolute knowing, that we have the capacities required for the recollection of of new experiences, if they so ever come to pass for us, and therefore, we will also have come sufficiently enough that we have enough to recollect and unify. Because you can have weird anomalous experiences that might be pointing towards a higher reality, but if you don't have a full access to that higher reality, of course you won't be able to figure it out. Of course it will never make sense to you. Of course it's beyond your reason, because you don't have the full experience of what is even rational there. So those kind of things, I think, are just bizarre arguments. Oh yeah, somebody asked, does Hegel ever talk about nature? Yes, he does. He has a whole thing called Philosophy of Nature. But he also talks about nature in every other place. Seriously. He talks about it in the Phenomenology of Spirit, a lot of places. He talks about it in the Science of Logic. He talks about it in the Philosophy of Nature. He talks about it in the Philosophy of Spirits. Talks about it absolutely everywhere. And his favorite hobby horses are physics, mathematics, and biology. But Hegel literally was a genius, and he knew about virtually everything in his time. Afterwards, obviously, things have just become so much more complex that it's pretty much impossible to be that concrete as a lone individual anymore. Hey, quit eating trash. Do we actually have the potentiality for absolute knowing? We're not God. Yes, we have the potentiality for absolute knowing. Well, no, we don't have the potentiality. We actually do have absolute knowing. It's just we don't have absolute knowledge. We don't have a fully articulated set of categories which we can be certain are the full categories of the world. As a matter of fact, there's one certainty. We are certain, without a doubt, that we don't have the full categories. There is a ton of gaps of so many things that are questionable that we really don't have any good reason to think that we really have a grasp of nature. And so when people complain, oh well, Hegel thinks he's figured it all out. Yeah, I think that's a proper criticism. I think that of Hegel himself as well. I thought that was hubristic. The way that he develops, for example, the philosophy of nature, and pretends that we really have a proper connection from, the different levels to different levels and concept to concepts. It's the same within the phenomenology of spirit. People are confused as how the movement happens between a lot of the forms of consciousness, the ways of knowing, because it doesn't seem to be something that experientially immediately connects. There are analogical things that I call analogical shifts, which logically work. They work with the logic. They are proper links, but nonetheless, they are not the full historical link in our lived experience, as the kind of beings that we are. Do you think there could ever only be one thing to know, the unit of knowledge which explains everything expressed in an intelligible form? Yeah, the absolute. To know that, I think, would require, however, far more content than we have. I think that there's significant evidence that there are other dimensions of experience. We don't have to talk about something like spatial dimensions or whatnot. We can literally talk about dimensions of experience that seem to point to the fact that we don't have all the facts of existence. And so there's a difference between absolute knowing and absolute knowledge. We can have absolute knowing of various things. If you understand being a nothing, you have a form of absolute knowing right there. There's no question. You don't need to have the rest of the entirety of the science of logic for you to be certain that this is indeed the case. The only problem with that is that it's not fully determined absolute knowing, simply because it's not a full self-account. Whereas the absolute idea is a full self-account of just the fact that this is all just this circle of reflection. Beyond that, however, I think things are open and closed. They're closed in that once we know how we think and how we cognize, we've got all the requisite categories to know just about everything else. The question is, do we actually know everything else that's instantiated in nature and whatnot? Those things are definitely up to question, and we're never fully justified, I think, at least not in this world, not as the beings that we are, in ever coming to the conclusion that we've got it all, because there seems to be always to be things that point towards more, and so long as you can't account for that more, insofar as the best that you can do to maintain the illusion that you really have everything is to hand wave things away and just say, well, according to my conception of the world and everything that I know of, this cannot be possible. You're not really accounting for everything. And so, and then it doesn't get into wacky ideas like maybe we're in the Matrix. Maybe we're in the Matrix. And if we're in the Matrix, all that goes out the window, because there will never be a full determination of anything. It can be whatever the hell whoever makes it wants it to be. And they can set it up that there's infinite dimensions. They can set up that there's infinite scales. But even then, actually you could still have an absolute knowledge in kind. Maybe not in empirical instantiations, but you can have it in kind. And therefore, there's some things on the fringe of science, for example, especially if you go into looking into fringe physics. And there's lots of ideas floating around, even in philosophy of physics, of the possibility that maybe forces are not specific forces, but they're kinds. Maybe you can have gravity A and gravity B. You can have, the same relation instantiating at different levels. That the same relation we call gravity happens, say, on a subatomic level. But the same, and there's another relation that's gravity C, at a higher degree, to something else. And sure, could that be possible? I don't see why not. I don't see why we should posit that it is, but I don't see why we should all just discount it and say, well, no, it's not possible. We have five senses, but are we experiencing with our tangibles in a way to know all? No. I think there's definitely way more going on than just your eyesight, your smell, your touch, your taste, your hearing. Definitely a lot more. I'm into weird shit, so you can believe it, you cannot believe it. All I would say is look into it. Parapsychological research. There's been plenty of experiments done about the possibility of telepathy. I can't exactly name the name right now, but there's this project that has been done to death about a possible telepathy link. They put people in isolated rooms, with wire frames and everything to dampen the radio signals and everything else possible. And they have them, send an image from one mind to another, from four possible images. And, if it's all random, you expect a general standard success rate of 25%, 1/4. But the general success rate found is 7% higher. It's 32% over thousands of trials. And so that's statistically highly significant. Does that mean something? I think so. What does it mean? I don't know. Because if telepathy was real, you would expect, God damn, that shit better work more than 30% of the time. It doesn't seem to work most of the time. It doesn't seem to work, like 99% of your life, and doesn't seem to ever have any telepathic experience. But who knows? There's also experiments done with micro telekinesis, the idea of thoughts affecting material reality. Actually, this one's famous. I heard about this long time ago. And it's a long-going a set of experiments in which people are just running these random number generators across the world. You can actually go and get the program for yourself, run it on your flash drive, and add it into the pool of data that's just always amassing. And it's just generating random numbers, and they ask you, well, occasionally focus your attention or intention on this number generator and think, go higher or go lower, and do that whenever the heck you feel like. And let's, or whenever they want to do something specific, they'll tell you when to do it, and they'll check to see, is there actually a fluctuation? And they find, well, yes, there is a significant fluctuation. And as a matter of fact, even when they haven't tried to be doing this, they keep running these in the background all the fucking time. The last time I heard about this was that before the 2008 election, there was a significant flux spike on the number generators in the United States. Because there was a conscious wave moving through the United States on the night before the election, and you would obviously then expect, well, yeah, of course, of course, and yes, you say it's all about frequencies. So yes, so the frequencies of stuff going on in your head, that's a very, very minor notion of psychokinesis, and it's easily explainable in terms of my Instagram is either Seawolf underscore AW or AW underscore Seawolf. C as in, the ocean. SEAWOLF. And I think that underline thing, underline. I think it's called an underscore. So figure that one out. I haven't posted anything in weeks. Even though we've had beautiful days and beautiful sunsets, I just kind of come around and instead gawk at it and walk around and go home. Haven't really felt like posting anything, even though I have a ton of pictures and quite a lot of them I like. So where was I going with the parapsychological stuff? Yeah, okay, yeah, I was going about the whole five senses thing. If that stuff is real, there's plenty of other things that come about how maybe we do have other senses which we don't realize that we have, and we don't count them. It's some people theorize that it's not just like, oh, a fifth or a sixth or a seventh or eighth sense. We could have upwards. Some people theorize we have upwards of something like 20 senses or something, depending on what you want to define sense as. Variations and categories like that. So could that be possible? I don't see any reason to just immediately discount that and say, well, no, that can't be possible. Well, we're not God. We don't know everything. So of course, you can't fully discount that, no matter how strange it seems to you. I'm open to that stuff just simply because I came to realize quite a while ago, well, I have no good reason to just immediately dismiss it. Even though, some of this stuff just sounds absolutely insane, so absolutely unbelievable, because it's the level of stuff of like, yes, I can go as far as saying, I believe these people are honest. I believe that they believe something happened to them. I believe, they're not lying, but, it's a level of incredulity in which, you don't want to go and say, but I believe that what they claim really happened as they think it happened. And so, one can have those kind of stopgaps, even though I think there's cases in which, it's the kind of stuff that, seeing is believing. And the closer it is to seeing, probably the closer is, the easier it is to believe. I have never experienced anything weird for myself. Not that I'm aware of it being weird. Supposedly, I did have an instance, but uh, to me, it's I couldn't verify whether it was or was not real. Weird. So to me, it was just like banal and regular. But other people I've known, have told me some very weird stories, and I don't believe they're making it up, and I don't believe there's a reason to say that what they say happened didn't happen, because it's both mundane, and it's the kind of stuff that you don't have to go and like, wow, it's not like some guy levitated or something. I could say, well, okay, maybe some guy did an illusion or something, um, and you just don't know how it works. Plenty of stuff happens. But for example, people stepping into a room and knowing things that they couldn't possibly know about somewhere that no one else that they had gone with could possibly know, and then having a pretty immediate confirmation that what was known was indeed correct, and it wasn't just some kind of weird hallucination. How do you explain stuff like that? I don't know. I don't know. I've had people in my family themselves have experiences like this, and they ask me, "What do you think about that?" It's like, is it an illusion? Is it some kind of just like mental glitch or something? Am I crazy? Because they actually would rather believe that it was just some kind of figment of their imagination, or that they're crazy, because it's so much weirder and so much more bothersome if you accept this stuff to really be real, and it freaks people out. So what can one say? Does your job involve philosophy? Pure reading philosophy and going to regular walks in the hills sounds like paradise. No, it's not. As a matter of fact, I just haven't been working for like the last 6 months. Uh, I work seasonally, and I found some places here that are cheap, and if I can save up the money, I can probably live up this life for quite a long while. Just working about half the year and just chilling the rest of the half of the year. And to me, that's a good life. I don't want a fucking house. I don't really care about having many things. All I want is time to do what I want to do, and time to be useful for other things. I like physical work. There's a place here that I found that I can buy myself a 30-foot trailer RV, and I've been told that up in Washington State, you can get like something that costs $40,000 here. Luxury trailer RV. You can go up to Washington and get that kind of stuff for like $15,000. Refurbished or close to new sometimes. I don't know why, but I suppose there's some kind of some business going up there. And so shit, I can get myself one of those. Bring it down here. There's a couple places down here that it literally costs $100 a month to park, and probably at maximum, during summer to run an AC will cost me about $150 more. So I'll be spending about what, something like $4,000 total in rent at max. Like that's theoretical maximum in the entire year. And in working a season, just working that 6 months, I can make about $15,000 a year, not counting the unemployment checks, which goes up to about $5,000 more. So I can be making about $20,000 working half the year, working my ass off for half the year, but then chilling the rest of the time and doing whatever the fuck I want. And, and like having super minimal expenses. And that's it. And I mean, to me, and my parents are like, don't you want a house? Don't you want to like, save for retirement? And my answer to that is, I can't give a fuck. Like, you work your ass off for what? You waste the peak of your years for what? To just survive and exist when you're fucking 60, and I know people who had that life, and their old age is not much of a life at all. And they're like, well, but you can philosophize then. Well, yeah, but I can philosophize now. I can have the time right now to live a pretty cheap life. Do what I'm trying to do, get what I'm trying to get to. And if I get to old age and it's all ache and pains, it's not like having more money will rid me of that, really. I mean, plenty of rich people who just get there and, money won't save you. It'll give you a couple more years, but money won't save you for much. And this desire to just live as long as possible for what? If you can barely fucking walk, I don't want to live that way. If you just live in fucking pain, I don't want to live that way. So they think I have a very backwards view of life, and we obviously disagree. When the time comes, you'll say you'll be sorry, and I'll say, well, that's life, isn't it? Some people regret that they wasted their early years. Some people regret that they didn't, save up for their later years. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how that goes. Because, I think that here in the US, depending on where you are, you can actually do very well for yourself if you're single and you don't have any responsibilities to take care of anybody. Once you have kids, you're fucked. Once you have kids, you're fucked. You got to have a career because you can't make it and, just kind of like jobbing it like I do. But if you don't, the single lifestyle is not that expensive. Not that expensive at all. Of course, you gotta be a minimalist, but I have no problems with that. And not only that, I like physical work. I really do. I can't imagine that I could work in an office, to be honest. I can't imagine that I could really work as an academic because everything that I see from that, I hate, I despise. Bores me to death. I don't want to be teaching classes to kids who don't want to be there. I don't want to be teaching class to people who aren't really interested. People who are just there to pass a grade. I don't want to be like writing for fucking journals. For what? Nobody reads that shit. Nobody cares. Writing for other academics is not an interest of mine. Doing academic work of that kind is not an interest of mine. I'd much rather be, if you ask about my intellectual goals is to kind of be this intermediary between academia and the philosophical enthusiast who's not in academia. I kind of want to do work in that intermediary space in which I'm not, cuck philosophy, for example. I'm not philosophy tube, but I'm also not a fucking jargon-filled, academic textbook. And when I talk to you, I don't want to talk in this fucking jargon. I hate that. I hate that so much. I hate it when I read it. I hate it when people speak like that. Because to me, that's nonsense. To me, that's just a waste. Would I volunteer to teach people genuinely interested? Yes, I do that already. If you look at my recordings, I look for people who are interested. I like to have people who come and ask me questions. Even if it's rereading the same shit. Every time I reread stuff with people, I reread it fresh. I don't look at my notes prior. I just start with a fresh copy of a PDF or book. And I do commentary as we read, and I explain things as they need to be explained. And that's what I enjoy. That's what I really like to do. And if I could do that and get paid, that would be the dream. That would be literally living the dream of Plato's Academy, which is, you get together and you have dialectic. For what? Not for some fucking journal, not because you're writing a fucking book, not because you need to make a fucking deadline or you need to impress anybody, but because you're genuinely interested in the ideas and you want to explore things together. That's the kind of people I want to hang out with. That's the kind of people I want to be connected with. People who are too busy to be engaging things because of academic work seem to me to be rather, I don't know, in a very different path to what I'm interested in. What were the times I consider as a waste? Not many, to be honest. I haven't really wasted much of my life. There was a time in which I did feel that there was a waste in which I was indecisive. And that was mainly to do with just my own well-being and my own economic well-being. And once I kind of got more decisive about that, I don't feel that much of my life was a waste. I used to be depressed prior to when I was 22, and my life was just going downhill. But nonetheless, I was always doing stuff. I was depressed, but I was always into science. I was always learning shit. People around me were always amazed that I knew a ton of shit because I was always reading articles, both popular as well as technical articles. God, I used to read like philosophy, not philosophy, but physics articles, from like fucking like phys.org and on these other free journals, just for fun. uh, Shit on chemistry and whatnot, all kinds of science. And it's just I've always been of a systematic mindset, and I always like learning, and I always like you know weird out there stuff, stuff that people just think like, what the fuck. Um, but I was depressed in personal matters. But then after I was 22, something happened in my life, and that reached the peak of depression. But that was also the turnaround point. At that peak of depression was also the point at which I finally managed to get a hold of myself and turn things around. And what had seemed so awful to me for so long, in retrospect, I look at that and say, it wasn't so bad. And it wasn't so bad, not because like, oh, well, like, God, you were in it, and it's like maybe you just misunderstood things. No, it was bad. It was a bad living situation, a bad mental mindset, and a bad environment in general. Uh, but I look at it and I say, I learned quite a lot. Because of the way that I grew up and the circumstances that I grew up, I had certain moments of reflection which other people don't have. Uh, and those have made me a lot better as a person than had I not had those negative experiences in my life. And so, I look at my life positively, and what used to seem like a waste, um, now I can see a learning experience in that, and I think that's part of what Hegel like also gets you to do, and what Hegel's all about the tarrying with the negative, and suffering is not the end all be all bad thing. Sometimes suffering is good. You can make it good if you take a learning approach to it. And so nowadays, my parents are like, quit wasting your time doing all these fucking YouTube videos and reading philosophy and talking to your friends all day. Go get a life, go get a girlfriend, go get married, go have kids, get a career. Uh, and so they think I'm wasting my time. I don't think I'm wasting my time. The only time I think I'm wasting my time is when I'm doing nothing. Like last week. Last week it was a real waste of time because I just was, I don't know, out of it, and I stopped reading. Didn't do anything, just kind of watched YouTube videos to pass away the day, and I didn't really learn that much. That's the only time I feel I'm wasting my time, when I'm doing nothing productive whatsoever in any capacity. That's when life is a waste. The majority of you disagree with my parents. Well, somebody gets something out of my ramblings. That's kind of the best that I can hope for. I don't really have any hope that I will ever make any money from this. Really. God, I look at people like who I deem successful. Gregory Sadler is about like a successful version of what I would like to do. Uh, he makes a living, but he's a busy guy. He's a very busy guy. And he works a ton of things, but even then, we live in a society where people don't appreciate this kind of stuff. You live in a society in which nobody wants to pay for this kind of stuff. People don't think that entertainment. People don't think that edification or self-building, all these other things, in a deep intellectual sense, has any value. People love that you produce videos. Uh, they won't give you a cent. They won't donate $1. It's too much, too much. It's like I give you, entire lectures that have taken me years to develop, and I do it for free. And if I set up a Patreon, I bet I probably wouldn't get more than $10 a month. But that's life. I'm not going to hold it against people. I can understand why people have this mindset. I myself feel this mindset quite a bit. For some reason, I'm willing to shell out $14 for a burger that, will last me about 20 minutes. But it feels like such a drag. It feels heavy on my wallet to shell out $10, for a lecture that entertains me for a week. A lecture that gives me something to watch, to think about for quite a while. And like it's just our fucked up, dumb, inverted values. And so I can understand that it's very hard to make money off of anything like this. And I don't expect to. My parents are like, well, at least write some books. And I'm like, well, yeah, sure, I'll write some books. Definitely, that's the goal, eventually. But academic books don't make any money. I mean, God, unless you write some kind of pop philosophy trash, you're not going to be making any money at all. I can understand people who write, even higher level pop philosophy, which tries to be articulate. That's not my style, and that kind of stuff gets semi-popular. But even then, nobody's making bank off this shit. So I don't want to stoop down to a Steven Pinker level or Dawkins level or some other kind of pop philosophy shit. And so if I ever make books, I doubt they'll be published by academic publishers. And I probably wouldn't want them to, partially because academic publishers have a way of killing your style. You have to write in an academic style. Like shit, if you were Hegel nowadays, you couldn't get a fucking book published by Cambridge Press because they'd go, oh, your style, it's just unclear and, just romantic shit and, too verbose, too technical, these other things. And I mean, imagine publishing something with the title Phenomenology of Spirit nowadays. No, it's gotta be boring. It's gotta be like so-and-so's and something else, some like dry titles. And I mean, you can't make things interesting, man. Winfield, originally published, he's a dry writer. He has his moments where he writes something witty and funny and interesting. For the most part, he's a dry writer, dry technical writer. But, he has some good ideas for titles. Like there was a book he wrote on the philosophy of nature from, Aristotle to Kant to Hegel and the different views. And originally he titled it The Philosopher's Guide to the Universe. And his fucking publisher went and changed the title to this really boring and drab, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel, the philosophy of nature, blah, blah, blah. And then, like, in two really, like, tiny words at the bottom of the page, it's The Philosopher's Guide to the Universe. What kind of marketing is this? I mean, like, are these people morons? Do they want books to not fucking sell? Do they want books to not fucking sell? Like, I see a book called The Philosopher's Guide to the Universe. That makes me want to look at what the content is. You read something like, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel, it's like the philosophy of nature, according to, an introduction or something. That stuff, the title is just boring. Like, why the fuck would you want that? Like if I wrote a book, I have a title already in mind. It's the title of my blog, The Empyrean Trail, and probably the subtitle, I could make it more fancy than just an introduction to Hegelian philosophy. Because, somebody looks at something and they're like, oh, the Empyrean Trail. And, if they know anything about esoterica, the kind of like terms, they'll go, oh, well, I've heard about something like that. And if they look up it on Google, they're like, oh, well, this sounds kind of interesting. Just from the title alone, and it's to do with philosophy. Okay. It sounds like some kind of fucking like grimoire, right? But, you write something like an introduction to Hegel, essays and blah, blah, blah. Who the fuck wants to read that? Who the fuck wants to read that? Not me, well, no, I read stuff like that, but just from just the title alone, you got to make things interesting. And academic publishers are really good at making things not interesting. So, you know, I might try. I'm starting to get connections that would be willing to give me some help in getting an academic publisher to look at a manuscript if I ever wrote one. But depending on what they say about it, I might just be disposed to just publish it myself, and let that be what it will. I don't expect to get any money. I would give the book away for free. Yeah, Hyperion's always also has ideas for books and stuff. Probably more erudite. Aloha. Assume you're in Hawaii. If you're not in Hawaii, why aren't you in Hawaii? Who was it that we knew from Hawaii? Hyperion. No, there's hares running all around here. God, that's so weird. Usually I see them in the bushes. Just kind of like hiding. Actually, I was walking earlier, and I saw this hare with like a totally fucked up head. Like it was just kind of like something. Something got to it, and it had like a really fucked up neck permanently. And just kind of stood there and kind of stared at me, and kind of got like something about like 5 feet from it, and then bolted off. And I'm like, sucks to be an animal. Sucks to be in that kind of life. Not the Hawaiian comrade. Wait, was that what he went to? No, he had another name. He had the channel Hawaii Left Review. Yeah, and then he became the kind of this weird. He still considered himself a leftist, but he said he gave up on activism and the communist project. But he was becoming a fan of Hayek and all these other things. We're like, what? It's a really bizarre guy. I had a whole breakdown, deleted everything. I think he's back. He has a Discord now, and they talk shit about me all the time, according to people who are in it. I mean, I don't really care. These people are small fries to me. They're not people whose criticisms I particularly care about or whose interest I desire. Speaking of Hawaii, isn't Hawaii, according to Richard Hoagland, Hawaii is at 19, well, one of the islands of Hawaii, one of them. I think it's the one where you have like the Hawaii observatory, the solar observatory. Well, I don't know if it's solar, but a big telescope pointed to the sky, basically. That island is exactly at like something like 19.5 latitude, and that has to do with some interesting stuff about the origin of storms and vortices on this planet due to a 4-dimensional hypersphere and its ways of rotating. So maybe that's a pointer towards a higher reality. Not sure which one it is. I just remember Hoagland like talked about it. Well, I stayed up a bit yesterday, and I read I think I read up to no, you didn't miss any videos last week. I didn't put any videos last week. I didn't do anything last week. I was just kind of out of it. I was reading Nietzsche yesterday. Continued reading Thus Spake Zarathustra. Interesting, but all I see is like a continuous repetition from what was said in like the first the first, the introduction, and then the first, what was it, the three metamorphoses. I mean, it's good. I like it, but at the same time, it's kind of getting repetitious, and I take highlights and notes of it. But at a certain point, I'm like, okay, I get it. These are various ways to communicate to you the concept of the Übermensch, and overcoming. But beyond that, yeah, like a lot of it gets repetitious, and so I don't know if I should just, like, I'm about 50 pages in, and it's a 400-page book. It seemed less long, but maybe it's just the way the PDF, things seem longer in certain things and shorter in others. And so. Do you think Hegel was ever bounded by the limits of his own mind? Most could progressively consider totality. Are philosophers useless because they don't consider totality? Was Hegel bounded by the limits of his own mind? Yes. He was bounded by the limits of his time, and I say this myself, and I suppose I just don't make it explicit enough in many places, even though there are explicit places, especially in the page blogs that I make. For example, in the Phenomenology of Spirit page on that book, and the Science of Logic page, and the Philosophy of Nature, I make specific criticisms about how Hegel goes too far in thinking that he really has it. That stuff like the Philosophy of Nature, the Philosophy of Spirit, there's so many gaps that it's hubristic the way that he thought that he could make a real connection. There's a way in which even Hegel realizes that dialectics becomes a conceptual game, that you can play this game of analogical links, which are valid according to Hegel's logic. They're completely valid, but they are not fully concrete in the historical existential sense. And I think that if we really want to get at capital S science in the fullest sense of the word, we want the concrete empirical sense. We don't just want a conceptual and analogical framework for things. And quite a bit of what Hegel does, when he can't do a direct empirical connection, he does an analogical connection. And it's to keep hold of the system. And it works, by the way. It gives you an intelligible link between the orders of nature, the orders of being, across ontological levels and across different disciplines. But you have to understand that there's a difference between the intelligible links and the real links. We can have an intelligible link, for example, between chemistry and biology. But we don't necessarily have, because of that, the full comprehension of the existential concreteness, which I guarantee you, I am convinced that there is also a real physical dynamic that goes on, which itself is the existential sublation. It's not just a conceptual intelligibility. It is a real existential sublation. You can see how the system really physically comes together. Hegel doesn't fully have that. He has it when it's there. When it's not there, he just makes analogical shifts. So yes, it's not complete. Not only that, Hegel has intimations. He's not as strong as Schelling does. When Schelling is willing to admit that he thinks that there is some supernatural element, that there is some sort of like psychic realm beyond the material realm. And this doesn't really have to do with supernatural stuff. If it exists, it's natural. Like, let's be clear about that. Supernature is just a weird way of putting it. It's just our assumptions about what nature is. And just because things seem different doesn't mean that they're not even material. There could be, for example, the existence of a soul. That is not an immaterial thing. It doesn't have to be. As a matter of fact, one would expect that it is actually material. There's plenty of reasons to think that it would be, and it wouldn't be nonsense whatsoever. That there could be an ethereal body or something. There could be some kind of ethereal biology that exists. We just don't normally see it because our senses aren't equipped for that kind of thing. And the interactions are different because of the different there's various physical mechanisms we could think about why the interactions would be weak and hardly noticeable at all. So there could be things like that. there's limitations that we're not free to say that we have the full picture at any point. I think we have quite a bit of the picture, but definitely not the full. Where to begin with Hegel? Uh, you could begin anywhere. You'd have to understand the method. Once you understand the method, it gives you a way to understand how things develop. It doesn't stop you from thinking about it in any other way. The first time I read the phenomenology with a group, we started with about 12 people, and then it quickly dropped down. But the first time we read it, people were bringing up things about commenting on paragraph, on sections, and they brought multiple points of view of interpretation, which are all, there. They're really present in the text. You can interpret it in this way. There are other ways in which people interpret the text which are not immanent in the text. They're just projections of our own personal times onto, trying desperately to grasp something in the text to connect with. And it's simply because we're not really connecting it in the purely logical manner. Hegel himself isn't purely connecting it just on purely logical manners, by the way, either. There's more than that going on. There's more concreteness. But grasping the logical manner will get you to see the depth of how simple it all really is. Like, it's not as complex as you think when you first read it. Read the phenomenology, and there's so many interpretations of sense certainty, for example, going on about, is he talking about the Greek spirit? Is he talking about cavemen? Is he talking about babies? Hegel really isn't talking about anything of that sort. That's not his interest. He's talking about just a mode of cognition which is immediate, and what could be known in that mode of cognition. And the way to criticize is from the point of our standpoint. And when you realize that the whole thing is basically as bare bones and simplistic as it seems, it doesn't get more complex than that. You don't have to be talking about those other things. You can make these reflections, and Hegel himself does these things, but you don't have to. Once you understand the real, complete bare bones dynamics, it gives you freedom to really grasp this and connect it to your real existence today. It allows you to connect it to philosophies today. It allows you to connect it to anything that you could connect it to. You're no longer stuck in this mindset of, oh, he's talking about this specific thing. No, he's talking about a real basic generality. And so grasping the method is, I think, more important to giving you the freedom of interpretation that you actually probably would want if you're reading, it as the work that it is. So where do you begin with Hegel? I would say begin with the science of logic, mainly because being a nothing, it's the easiest one to get. If you get it, you get it all. If you can get being and nothing, it is so simple. When you grasp it, you feel stupid because you're like, holy shit, this is simple. But if you can't grasp it, I can almost guarantee you will not be able to grasp it in any other concrete form. You'll be able to get glimpses of what is going on, but you'll never fully grasp what it really is if you cannot grasp it at the bare bones, simplistic reflection. And Hegel does his best to show you how to do it. The way the logic is written is an exercise guide. You're supposed to do the exercise. He says being, pure being, and nothing else. It's a pure immediacy. That stuff tells you what you're supposed to be looking at and what you're supposed to be thinking with. And then Hegel just invites you to think with it. And then he guides you and tells you what you should have thought with it, if you really thought with it. And if you grasp what's going on there's multiple ways to grasp it, by the way. I didn't originally grasp it in its purity either. But I took it in a very literal sense, and it made sense to me. Later on, I figured out through a bit of work, how it really was working. So you got to grasp you got to grasp at least the first chapter. The first two chapters, the better, I think. If you can grasp the first chapter of the Science of Logic, you've got it. You've got the key. If you can grasp the second chapter, you got the level of determination which gives you the first full form of the key. And once you go back to the phenomenology of spirit, I guarantee you it will just shock you how clear it becomes once you have these moves down in your mind and you've practiced the movements. And suddenly everything else becomes much clearer. Any thoughts on dialectical materialism? I don't think there's such a thing as dialectical materialism, honestly. I think that's nonsense that Marx himself made up. I think Marx himself was very, very well aware that this doesn't really work, that you can't have an idealist dialectic and you cannot have a materialist dialectics. He himself knew very well it was all about content form. You have dialectic or you don't. There's a very well, I can't look for it right now. Maybe I'll post it in the comments later and you can look it up. There's an article about Lenin when he read Hegel, The Science of Logic, while he was in exile. And Hegel, I mean, Lenin comes to the realization himself and he writes in his notes that he now understands that the idealist materialist dichotomy is nonsense. That once you get to a certain point of the logic, you realize this isn't true. It cannot be true, for various reasons of what it means, for what dialectic itself means. And so Lenin actually privately comes to realize these things. He never publicly states it because it was just you would lose ground. Marxists are materialists, and everybody knows that. Engels said it, and Marx says it so many places. You just have to go with it. But Lenin himself realized that this was not true. I realized it was not true when I first read the Phenomenology of Spirit. Before I even understood what dialectic was, I read the Phenomenology of Spirit for the reason that I wanted to know what the fuck dialectic was. I read Marx, I read Marxist. Nobody was making a good case for what the hell this was and why it mattered. And so I decided to read Hegel. I read the Phenomenology of Spirit, and the first thing I noticed, I didn't understand what dialectic was, but I realized one thing: whatever was going on had nothing to do with what people say about materialism and idealism. Because you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, and it just looks like good epistemology. It's just a critical epistemology. The first thing that, because I came at it from the knowledge of epistemology and basic ontology, more so epistemology. I was more interested in the skeptical problems of epistemology. And when I looked at what Hegel was doing, I said, well, this is the same kind of thing a materialist would be doing, in criticizing these fake, false cognitions. And so you read up, from sense certainty, perception, force and understanding. You get to the Lord Bondsman. And you look at what's going on, and it's all there. Hegel's talking about material relationships. He's talking about, ways and modes of life, and you wonder. I wondered immediately, what is this idealism then? If it isn't what, Marxists say it was, if it isn't what all these other people say it was, and the answer is, there really is nothing normal about that. Hegel is an idealist, yes, but the meaning of idealism is not common. It's not normal. Neither is Marx's materialism, by the way. I have an essay that I'm writing in which I'm trying to finally compare them in explicit form. And if this is a single essay, it's going to be immensely long, very, very long. And, I go on about how Marxist materialism has nothing to do with what people understand as materialism. It has nothing to do with this metaphysical thing, this metaphysical substance we call materialism. It's about a relationism. It's about a process of living, but it has nothing to do with matter. Marx has no interest in matter whatsoever. Marx is interested in the fact that there are objective relations which are not subject to mere conscious willing and enforcement. that there are objective modes of life that arise in the very ways we live. This is not in contradistinction to Hegel himself. Hegel himself also says plenty of things about how we first live, and based on how we live, we know. And that's, where ideas really come from. They come from our life activities. Hegel's the first one to even say that. And so you look at what Hegel really does, and Hegel himself actually has an even broader materialist understanding than Marx does. Marx focuses on the economic, material, productive side of life. Hegel doesn't. And Marx is right to focus on it. It's a real thing. And it's a thing that, anybody who tries to be a Hegelian later on has to incorporate. You cannot do Hegelianism post-Marx without bringing in Marx. It's just impossible. These questions of technological, economic developments are highly important. It's the same thing, like, once you realize, at least according to what I understand by what Giorgiani says about what Heidegger says about technology, if Heidegger's insight on technology is that technology is prior to theoretical science in lived life, then that is perfectly in line with Hegel's theory of logic. That logic is our knowing activity. What we know is our knowing. What we know is how we know. And therefore, what we would know in science is what we can practically do, which is based on our technological developments of instruments. And so, is technology more primal than science? Yes, historically. But at the same time, this also isn't true, because technology is also subject to theoretical cognition, in which we don't have to be talking about a really advanced scientific cognition of force and all these things. Animals have a theoretical cognition, just in the fact of how they do things. Cause and effect relations are theoretical cognitions already. And so, already you already have the being of a theoretical science with a practical science as well. And so, I think ultimately there is no primacy of the technological to the ideological. They come together. But on the existential side, the way we experience that is indeed, yes, first comes activity and then comes knowledge, awareness, a recollection of that activity. And so likewise, our social ideologies are based on our forms of production, our relations technologies, production, all these other things, because those are the ways we live. Eminem Skittle says, I have a friend who thinks everyone is a philosopher. He claimed this because every person, no matter how dumb they are, has a personal method for thinking. Yeah, that's bullshit. If you're talking about philosophy and philosophers, this has a very specific thing. That everything is philosophically infused is true, undeniable. We have implicit philosophies everywhere at all times, with all peoples. It's impossible to escape. This does not make things philosophy, which is why I have problems with people talking about, like, well, why don't we Westerners recognize African philosophy? Well, because there isn't African philosophy. There is no body of knowledge which is based on rational argumentation and development of dialectic of that sort. There are doctrines based on things, and these doctrines are philosophical, but they are not philosophy. They have philosophical implications in them, and sometimes these implications are actually made very explicit. But there is no philosophy as such going on. It's not an awareness of this activity for itself, being determined. So, just simply having ideas, which are obviously going to have implicit real cognitions of concepts, that does not make you philosophical. And YT, just don't get how one can acquire truth. Isn't consciousness limited to only a couple of variables at a time? I'm not sure if you can repeat that question, if I can answer it. I'm not sure what you're asking. Lithlin says, in the era of fragmentation, the organization of appearances makes movement a linear succession of motionless instants. Yeah, I agree. It's also the same thing with, I think like the philosophies of difference. They focus too much on just like everything's going, moving, and nothing stays the same. Everything's just treated as different. But there's no real fundamental analysis of the complete comprehension of these movements. Leifton says this notch-to-notch progression is perfectly exemplified by Stalinist dialectical materialism. I read part of that, Stalin's on dialectical materialism. It's awful. I agree. The concept of truth, by the way, is rather interesting. Winfield has his book. What is it? Hegel and the Future of Systematic Philosophy. There's a chapter in that. You should really look it up. It's really good. It's called The Good and the True. And it goes about the history of the idea, the Platonic idea, and how this originally conceived truth. That the idea was the way in which the one thing which could come to self-correspondence, in which reason could come to correspond to itself in a purely rational form. And this was the implicit, conception of truth that Plato was trying to get at, but he couldn't cash it out. He couldn't find a way to harmonize the good, the true, and the beautiful in such a way that he could cash out exactly what the ideas truly were. And then you go up to Kant, you shift to the Kantian times, and you go through as to why Kant reaches a certain standpoint on the ideas, simply because he can't conceive of how Plato's self-reflection of the idea is really possible. And therefore we have the noumenal phenomenal divide, and we get the ideas pushed back into the noumenal realm as simply regulative ideals, which we can never achieve. And then how Hegel has this in the dialectic of the idea at the end of the science of logic, between the dialectic of the good, which is the practical idea, and the dialectic of the true, which is the theoretical idea, in which the point of the good is to make reality true, and the point of truth is to simply know reality. So there's a dichotomy there. One already assumes that the good is true and that reality is failing somehow, and it's the point of the good is that we're going to raise reality to meet with a good, and therefore we have to impose upon reality. The theoretical idea, which is the idea of the true, is the reverse, in which we don't assume the good. We assume that the reality is just what it is, and it cannot be otherwise, and therefore all we want to do is observe it. And then there's the multiple modes of cognition in which the idea of the true has, or the idea of theory and practice. Literally, it's theory and practice. I mean, this is it's an amazing thing. If you're a Marxist, this is actually interesting to you, because what do you know? What is a big deal for Marxists? The unity of theory and praxis. A big deal, talked about all the fucking time. Most people have no idea what this even means. And so Hegel has this in the science of logic, and he goes on about this problem about how we cannot solve this in the way that we normally think about this, that the ultimate solution is brought about in the absolute idea, which is, what do you know? It's the unity of theory and praxis, where what is true, what is good, is one solid movement. It's not that the world is not yet good, because if it is not yet good, there's no way you could bring the good. You have a dichotomy. And if it's not yet true, there's no way you can get the true out of it either. So you have that dichotomy. And so the absolute idea managed to be the unity of the practical, the good, in the true, the theory, in that it is it conceives the good and the true as one single process of becoming. That, if you're if you're going to realize the good, it's because it's already in the process of realization. Marx says communism is not a state of affairs to be realized; it is already the real process. That's it. That's the truth of the theory and praxis. That it's not an idea in your head. It's not that you have to come up with the good first and then it will become a reality. Now you have to impose it on reality. That's not how it happens. And Marx was aware of this. This is part of the tragedy of people not understanding how Marx thinks and what Marx really knows. Marx was very well aware that the unity of theory and practice is not really up to you. The unity of theory and practice is about the fact that if you have a true theory, it's going to show up as a real practice. The unity of theory and practice is in capital, for example, not because we have to make capital true, but because capital is already true as capital. Why does capital accord with reality? Why does the reality of capitalism go so well with Marxist theory of capital? Well, because Marxist theory of capital is the theory of the practice of capitalism itself. So it's a practical theory. So you don't have this issue of, how do we unite theory and practice? You don't have to. It's already done. The theory is the theory of the practice. And so the issue that we have nowadays is that people have these theories that they come up with that have no real practical reality already. And therefore then they're stuck in this problem. How do we make this true? How do we make this real? How do we engage the practice? You're never going to make it. You're never going to make it that way. You can't concoct a movement in your head and then try to impose it on reality. It's not going to work, which is why Marx doesn't advocate this either. Marx, is all about engage the real movement, go where the real movement is, and work through that, because you're not going to spark anything else with some abstract theory of the good about what we should be doing if it's not already happening. You cannot go and tell people, you should be unionizing if nobody feels the need to unionize. If that movement is not going on, you're losing your time. You're wasting your time. And so, if you want to have a true theory, you have a theory of the practical reality of things, why is Hegel's theory of logic true? Because it's about the practical reality of reason. Just look at how the logic functions. It's about the reason of reasoning. It's about the thinking of thinking. It's about the self-coherence and self-correspondence of reason to itself. That's why we can know that it is true, because it corresponds to itself. Anything that is true corresponds to itself. Not, an apple isn't true because it corresponds to your silly little notion of whatever you believe an apple is. An apple is true as an apple because it corresponds to its own nature. An apple doesn't need you to tell it that it's real, that it really is the thing that it is. You can be skeptical about the apple. It doesn't matter. The apple will do as the apple does because it is what it is. It corresponds and it produces its own nature. It produces itself as the tree, the leaves, the flowers, the fruit, the seeds, and it has its own life cycle, and it can pollinate itself. It has its own self-genesis, and that is all that the truth ever really is. It's a self-correspondence of things to themselves. Are they fully true? No, because, they're not fully absolute and self-grounded, but they are true insofar as they manage that capacity. So, I'm not one of these people who really thinks that we ought to be out there starting movements. I say let things happen organically. And of course, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with sitting back and saying, well, we're gonna be working our own little things and trying to work it out in theory before we do the practice. That's good. Lenin did that. The Bolsheviks did that. Other socialists have done that. But I think that you should look at the reality of the history and notice very, very peculiarly and interesting that the most genuine insights are gotten not prior to the revolution, but after it. The most genuine insights are gotten after the real practical realities of the real problems that face us, come about. And then we can now really concretely tackle these. This has been going on for 8 hours. Yeah, but people don't get to talk to me that much. They get to talk to me live. It's Ask AW anything time. Yeah, Balboa Jr. is probably also bored. But really, I just don't want to go home. I like being out here in nature. But yeah, all right. I think I'll wrap it up. I did talk about life. I revealed some deep personal details about my history, and you stalkers can now go and look it up or something. Do I think we can afford to sit back? No. No, when I say that I don't think you can impose movements. I'm just saying that you can't sit back and theorize about what reality should be in a context. This is mainly a critique of these people who I call left communists. And these people are people I despise because they're idealists in a bad sense. They don't like the current society and they critique the current society, but they have no actual practical means to do anything about changing society. And they refuse to engage in this society in any way because they are beautiful souls and it would just go against their pure moral standards, and theoretical standards. I'm saying that, you ought to push for things, but you ought to push for things as it can be done now. If what you're doing is going around waving flags with pamphlets about how we need revolution now, it's not going to happen. That's not how it works. It didn't happen with the Bolsheviks. It didn't happen in Cuba. Hasn't happened anywhere that I know of. Because that kind of message doesn't get through to people until you have a revolutionary situation. And when you have a revolutionary situation, people don't actually flock to you because you have some fucking slogans. And all of a sudden they realize that you had known about their plight all along. No. They go to you because you have a base of power and they see that you have a vision. They don't care about the truth of your bullshit. They don't care about capital being a true theory about capitalism. That's not what they're going after. That's not what's ever changed anybody's minds in general in mass. The masses of people aren't studying Marx. The masses of the people know some very basic shit. And so, if you want to do anything practical, you have to do things that are practically doable now. I have far more sympathies with people who are saying, let's go into hyper development of technologies and undermine capitalism that way. That's a far more realistic thing than just going, well, we need communism now. We need communization when the revolution happens. We need to get rid of all hierarchy and all these other bad things. Can't do that. In the US, if you're going around preaching communism, you're an idiot. And if you're too pure to do anything of that sort, because it's against your idealist beliefs, then you're not going to go anywhere. That's just the simple truth of it. People go like, oh my God, Bernie, the people on the left hate Bernie because he's buying off the working class, with this soccer damn shit. And, he's staving off the revolution. Well, we're at a point in the US in which we're not radical enough. And if I assure you, I'm certain of this, that if we had a revolution today, if we had a revolutionary crisis, we would be fucked because the right wing would be the ones to lead it, not the left. Guaranteed. But anyways, yeah, this is going on for 2.5 hours. Thanks for tuning in. Sure, I like communists, and not the ones who do nothing. Yeah, I have respect for people who are real communists. I consider real communists to be the people doing things, uh, not people writing books, not people sitting on their fucking ass arguing on Twitter and making YouTube videos, not people on college campuses organizing students. Those aren't communists. But anyways, to wrap this up, thanks for listening. I hope you found it entertaining. I gotta go eat. I've been rambling for quite a bit, so we'll see when I do this next time. Probably not anytime soon, really. I'll start work at the latest next month. So yeah, I'll try to start doing some more videos on the stuff that I'm reading. But yeah, this has been Antonio Wolf. See you around.